Okay, um, I'm here. Uh, I'm a little nervous today because for the Revelation lecture, I have my own personal sword of Damocles hanging over my head. Uh, in this case, it is the sickle of the Son of Man from Revelation chapter 14. So this is it's pretty frightening. I'm gonna try to keep focused and get it together, but just so you know, there's a lot going on today. Uh, Things seem a little scattered. Might be because I'm distracted. Got that thing over my head. I just don't know what to do. So, anyway, Revelation and Revelation's use of the Old Testament. That's what we're on about today. Revelation is interesting in that it provides a couple of unique challenges to us as we start getting into its use of the Old Testament. Revelation as a book is suffused with Old Testament imagery. You can't read hardly 3 or 4 verses in the book of Revelation without there being some sort of significant point of conversation with Old Testament precedents. Whether we're talking about how Jesus is described as one like a son of man, or whether we're talking about allusions to the tribe of David, the Lion of David, or the heavenly Jerusalem that evokes chapters from Isaiah. Throughout the whole book, there are all kinds of allusions and apparent references to the Old Testament. However, the book of Revelation contains few, if any, direct references to the Old Testament. There's no introductory formulas used. There's one place where it says that they're singing the Song of Moses, but actually what follows isn't any sort of direct citation from the Old Testament. So that's one of the challenges. Another line of challenge is that sometimes parallel imagery is used, or extensive imagery is used from an Old Testament text, but when you go and look at the Old Testament text, you realize that the way it's being used in Revelation is perhaps subversive to the message that you find in the original Old Testament context. So we'll see a little bit of that at the end. But those are a couple of the challenges before us and things to lay the groundwork as we get in. Um, there are a couple of ways that folks have talked about the relationship between Revelation and Old Testament prophets. Some of them are on a large scale, so I just want to give a brief overview of this before we get into some of the particulars. In structure, Revelation is similar to things that you might find in books like Jeremiah or Isaiah or Ezekiel, major prophets, where the books tend to focus at the first on Jerusalem or Israel, Judah, the people of God. And so it says this is why you're so bad. And then they go into oracles against the nations. Things that we can't imagine that the nations ever actually heard, and yet things that were words of judgment from God on these foreign nations, neighbors of Israel. From these oracles of judgment, then um, the prophets would go into promises of vindication or salvation. Revelation follows a similar pattern, where it begins in the first couple chapters with the letters to the churches, focusing very directly on what the churches, the people of God, have done right or wrong. But then in chapter 4 through about chapter 17 or 18, the book is very much focused on the nation, specifically on Rome, as it's talked about under the language of Babylon and God's judgment on Rome. But then the last couple chapters of the book, chapters 20, 21, 22, very much focused on the coming salvation and deliverance. So it doesn't break up quite that neatly, but there is a general pattern that some of these prophets follow. So that's one way that Revelation maybe is modeling on what came before. More specifically, folks have looked to the book of Ezekiel as providing a number of points of contact with the visions that we see John experiencing in his gospel. And I'm going to click over to an article by a guy named Alan Bandy here on your screen. And he has a table here where he's summarizing a work of someone named Kalowski. And this is from Journal for the Study of the New Testament, volume 31, as you can see. Okay, so here's what he says. Basically, there are, in each of them, two movements, and the movements go from a place of exile to a person who is drawn up by the Spirit into a vision of a place of God's presence. And then that pattern repeats as again as toward the middle to the end of each book. The seer finds himself in a place of exile, and then he's drawn by the Spirit into a place of God's presence. So, going back up to the top here, in Ezekiel, the place of exile is the Kibar River, where Ezekiel is in exile with the other exiles. In Revelation, John is on Patmos. Each of them are carried away by the Spirit, and language that seems to be intentionally replicating. When they come into the presence of a holy angel, each of them fall face down before them, and then they're encouraged to stand up. After these visions, they're each carried away to see more, carried away by the Spirit specifically in both Ezekiel and then also in Revelation. So there is, in each of the books, a structural similarity where you have somebody who's distant from the place of God's presence, who receives a word of encouragement indicating that God's presence is once again going to be with his people. And both of the books end with these visions of a glorified place where God is present and God's people coming to fill that place as well. So there is what seems to be an intentional modeling of the book of Revelation on some of the dynamics of the book of Ezekiel as well. I'll just get all my pictures back like they need to be. Okay, so those are some general things. Where I want us to move now is from some of these general structural things into some more specifics about how, specifically how Jesus is described, first of all, and then how Jerusalem is described, and how these evoke images from the Old Testament. There are some indications in Revelation, although it doesn't use quite this language, that the scenes we see in front of us and the people we see in front of us in the book are fulfillments of Old Testament expectations. So I want to start with what Jesus says about himself in Revelation chapter 3 as he is addressing the church of Philadelphia. So in 3:7 we read this. Write this to the angel of the church of Philadelphia. These are the words of the one who is holy and true, who has the key of David. Whatever he opens, no one will shut, and whatever he shuts, no one will open. Now, this is an allusion to Isaiah 22. In Isaiah 22, there's an oracle of judgment against an administrator in the house of David, somebody who wears the royal insignia, acts for the Davidic kings, and speaks for them. But there's one who has apparently overstepped his bounds. So this is from Isaiah 22, picking up in verse 15. Yahweh, God of heavenly forces, says, Go now to this official, to Shebna, who is in charge of the house, that would be the house of David, and say to him, What do you have here? And whom do you have here, that you have hewed out a tomb for yourself, you who cuts a grave on high and carves himself a home in the cliff? Yahweh is about to hurl you down, mighty man. He is surely going to cover you with darkness. Down to verse 19. I will thrust you down from your monument. You will be pulled down from your platform. On that day, I will call my servant Eliakim, Hilkiah's son. I will give him your robe. I will wrap him in your sash, and I will hand over to him your authority. He will be a father to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to the house of Judah. I will place the key to David's house on his shoulder. What he opens, no one will close. What he closes, no one will open. I will fasten him securely like a tent peg, and he will be a throne of honor for his ancestors' house. All the honor of his household will hang on him, the offspring of his offshoots, every little dish, every bowl, every jar. So here's a promise, not of a Davidic king specifically, but of one who sits, in a sense, sits on the Davidic throne, one who takes over that place, or not really takes it over, but one who acts on behalf of the Davidic house as a steward, as an administrator of what is David's. So he wears this sash of Judah. He holds the key, who lets people into David's house or keeps people out. So, in a sense, Jesus is here claiming, using Davidic language, but applying an Old Testament text that wasn't about David himself, but one who exercised authority over David's house. Now, it's interesting that this person is one who holds the key, who lets people into the house of David or shuts them out of the house of David. Highly honored position. But one thing that's interesting about this is how the prophecy to Philadelphia continues, where Jesus says to this church, I know your works. Look, I've set in front of you an open door that no one can shut. You get to, in other words, come into the house of David, into the throne room of David. You have so little power, and yet you have kept my word because you haven't denied my name. Because of this, I will make the people from Satan's synagogue, who say they are Jews and really aren't but are lying, I will make them come and bow at your feet and realize that I have loved you. The people who are addressed by this one who lets people into the house of David, they get to sit on this throne, and the others will come, notice, and bow down at their feet. They get to sit in the position of the one who represents the Davidic king and have the others come and bow down before them. You see, it's not just that Jesus is the Davidic king, but he opens the way to Davidic kingship, and he opens the way to representing God and kingship for all of God's people. This is a theme that actually carries on, and I want us to move to the Psalm 2 thing, and it carries on in a few places throughout the book. What is going on in Psalm 2? Psalm 2 is God giving the Davidic king the throne, and the nations coming and bowing before this Davidic king, and the king ruling over the nations with a rod of iron. That's what we see in Psalm 2. Now, let's see how Psalm 2 is echoed in the message to Thyatira. This is at the end of chapter 2 of Revelation. He says, to those who emerge victorious, this is verse 26 of chapter 2, to those who emerge victorious, keeping my practices until the end, I will give authority over the nations, to rule the nations with an iron rod, and to smash them like pottery. Just as I received authority from my Father, I will also give them the morning star. Did you hear what just happened there? Jesus here is speaking as one who has received authority to rule the nations, and what he has said to these churches is that he will allow them to participate in that authority. Here's the quote from Psalm 2. He says, I will announce the Lord's decision. He said, you were my son. Today I've become your father. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your possession, the far corners of the earth your property. You will smash them with an iron rod. You will shatter them like a potter's jar. That's the verse that's alluded to in chapter 2. To those who emerge victorious, keeping my practices until the end, I will give authority over the nations, to rule the nations with an iron rod and smash them like pottery. The people, not just Jesus, but the people fulfill the vocation of the Davidic king. They fulfill the promise to the Davidic king to rule over the nations with an iron jar. This same verse from Psalm 2 is also alluded to in chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse 5. But this time, it's not referring to the people of God, it's referring to Jesus himself. The woman gave birth to a son, a male child who is to rule all the nations with an iron rod. Her child was snatched up to God and his throne. So both Jesus and his followers are participating in this rule over the nations on God's behalf. And the verse appears one more time in chapter 19, verse 15. From his mouth, the mouth of this Jesus figure, comes a sharp sword that he will use to strike down the nation. He is the one who will rule them with an iron rod, and he is the one who will trample the winepress of the Almighty God's passionate anger. So Jesus is the one who rules with an iron rod, and yet Jesus rules because God has given him to sit and share in God's own throne and ruling over the nations. And then Jesus turns to his faithful followers and invites them to sit on his throne and extend his rule. So it's true of Jesus' followers, but it's true of them only because it's true of Jesus first, and Jesus wraps them into what is his. So there's an extension of, and perhaps transformation of, this promise to David. We'll see something like that again in a few minutes. Another place where the Davidic kingship comes up is when the Lion of the tribe of Judah is disclosed in chapter 5. And this is a place where I have a little bit of a different reading than your Stephen Moise reading for this week, so you can get in there and compare and contrast. In chapter 5, the Lion of the tribe of Judah is revealed. So the idea of the great conquering king, the one who's conquered, and therefore he can open up the seal of the scrolls. But when he's revealed not as a ferocious lion, but as a slaughtered lamb. And as the book of Revelation unfolds, we find out that it is in fact because he is the slaughtered lamb that he is the one who is also the conquering lion. Put it this way, it's precisely in being slaughtered, it's through his blood that he has redeemed a people for God from every nation, tribe, and tongue, and that is what enables him to be enthroned, the victorious conqueror, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So I do think that there is here a revelation of the Davidic lion, but there's also a surprise, because what is revealed is not simply a lion, but at the same time the slaughtered lamb. So it's not a one who conquers by slaughtering, first of all. It's one who conquers and finds his throne by being slaughtered. So this is the surprising upside-down economy of the kingdom of God that runs throughout the book of Revelation, that it's the martyrs and the blood that surprisingly conquer the enemies of God's people. So see what you think about how the Davidic king is depicted in the book of Revelation. Two more things that I want to look at briefly. One is the Davidic promise that God makes to David in 1 Samuel chapter 7. The promise that that God makes to David is a promise of being a father to David's children, and of David's son being a son to God. And this is a promise that we see echoed in Revelation 21. Revelation 21:7 reads like this: "Those who emerge victorious will inherit these things," this new heaven, this new earth that's coming about. "Those who emerge victorious will inherit these things. I will be their God, and they will be my sons and daughters." Now, this verse here is in fact an echo of God's promise to David, that from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, he says, "Your son David will build a house for my name, and I will establish his throne forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. I will be his father, and he will be my son." That verse is what is echoing in Revelation 21:7. But here, it's not simply the one Davidic king, Jesus, for example, who is the son to God, but all of those who overcome are God's sons. And here, God will be all of their father. So we see a similar thing happening in chapter 21 as we saw in chapter 2. There's a promise about Davidic kingship, And it's not simply applied to Jesus, but it's applied to all of those who rule through him and share in his reign and share in his sonship. So Jesus does reign in the book of Revelation, but as he reigns, he shares that reign. You can see a similar, more Davidic imagery in chapter 22. But what I want to draw our attention to is both that the allusions seem to indicate a fulfillment of Davidic imagery and that they also extend it and transform it in a couple of ways. Next thing I want us to see is that Revelation draws on the Danielic imagery of a son of man. And you see that there's some references to Daniel in chapter 1 with the coming of the clouds, but that seems to be God in Revelation 1, not Jesus, the Son of Man. But Jesus is described as the Son of Man in 1:13. But where I want us to focus is on the harvest imagery of chapter 14 and that sickle that looms over my head. In chapter 14, there is a harvest of the earth. Chapter 14. I looked, and there was a white cloud. On the cloud was seated someone who looked like the human one. He had a gold crown and a sharp sickle in his hand. Another angel came out of the temple, calling in a loud voice to the one who was seated on the cloud. Use your sickle to reap the harvest, for the time to harvest has come, and the harvest of the earth is ripe. So the one seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he also had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who has power over fire came out from the altar, and he said in a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, Use your sharp sickle to cut the clusters in the vineyard of the earth, because its grapes are ripe. So the angel swung the sickle into the earth and cut the vineyard of the earth, and he put what he reaped into the great winepress of God's passionate anger. Then the winepress was trampled outside the city, and the blood came out of the winepress as hard as the horses' bridles for almost 200 miles. This is imagery of the Son of Man who comes on the cloud, and yet it also combines imagery from Joel chapter 4, which is harvest imagery. There are a couple of other places, other ways that what you see in Daniel 7 is transformed. In Daniel 7, the Son of Man comes on multiple clouds, not one cloud. It's singular here. Also, Daniel 7 doesn't specify that this Son of Man wears a crown or that he's a king figure. It does say, however, that he rules. So it could be that this is simply an extension of that, a literalization of the kingship. But as the two passages are drawn together, Daniel 7 and Joel 4, we also find that this Son of Man is equipped with a sickle. So there is a blending of the images, this one not being one of enthronement per se, but a different kind of eschatological image, where that Son of Man from Daniel is now participating in the harvest of the earth, a judgment harvest, where God is perhaps going to gather some into his storehouse, but he's also going to see to it that some of this harvest of the earth is trampled in God's wrath. So something we've seen before happen, where the combining of a couple of images transform them. So there's not a neat one-to-one correlation either between Daniel 7 in this passage or Joel 4 in this passage. And maybe something you guys can talk about in your groups is what's the effect of taking two very different kinds of eschatological images and bringing them together? How does it transform our understanding of the Son of Man? How might it transform how we understand what the eschaton is supposed to look like? Okay, one final set of images. We've gone from Davidic imagery to Son of Man imagery. Now I want us to look at some Jerusalem bride imagery. We're aware of Revelation 21, where the bride appears and comes down as though it's one who is adorned for her husband, for marriage. This imagery is imagery that is built on largely from Isaiah 44. And you guys have a reading today that talks about how Revelation 21 builds on the imagery of Isaiah 54, and it also indicates that Revelation, in building on the imagery of Isaiah 54, is not alone. There are other Jewish people who reread Isaiah 54 in light of their understanding of their own communities as the eschatological people of God. So Isaiah 54 is about it's a song to Zion, or the city of God, Jerusalem. Sing, barren woman who's borne no child, break forth into singing and cry out, you who are never in labor. This is a song encouraging Jerusalem in exile to celebrate its restoration. Verse 4, don't fear, because you won't be ashamed. Don't be dismayed, you won't be disgraced. You will forget the shame of your youth. And now verse 5, the one marrying you is the one who made you. Yahweh of heavenly forces is his name. The one redeeming you is the Holy One of Israel, the one called the God of the earth. So there's that marriage imagery for Jerusalem. Your God is marrying you. And in Revelation, of course, the imagery is transformed, where it's not God who's marrying Jerusalem, but it's the Lamb who's marrying the city. But the city is the bride. And as the description goes on, it says that it gives this description of the city. Verse 11, suffering one, storm-tossed, uncomforted, look, I am setting your gemstones in silvery metal, and your foundations with sapphires. I will make your towers of rubies, and your gates of beryl, and your walls of precious stones. So Isaiah 54 anticipates a beautiful, cosmic, restored Jerusalem in which there is a foundation and walls and ramparts of precious, beautiful stones. And this is the tradition that Revelation 21 is picking up on and amplifying. Verse 9 of Revelation 21. One of the 7 angels who had 7 bowls of the 7 last plagues said, come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife. He took me in a spirit-inspired trance to a great high mountain, and he showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. The city had God's glory. Its brilliance was like priceless jewel, like jasper that was clear as crystal. It had high walls with 12 gates, and by them were these angels. And then skipping down to verse 17. He measured the thickness of the wall. It was 216 feet thick, as an angel measures them. Verse 18. The wall was built of jasper. The city was like pure gold, like pure glass. The city's foundations were decorated with every kind of jewel. First jasper, second sapphire, third... I don't even know how to say that. Chalcedony? Chalcedony. The fourth was emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth carnelian, and on it goes. The gates each was made from a single pearl, and the city's street was gold, transparent as glass. So there is a picture of this glorious Jerusalem, and it builds on and amplifies the picture that you see in Isaiah 54. There are a couple of other ways that this Jerusalem bride seems to be drawing on imagery from Isaiah. Some of it is that in Revelation 21:3, it says that there are peoples, not just a people of God, but there are peoples, plural, and that might be drawing on Isaiah's imagery of a house for all peoples, a house of prayer for all the nations, something that gets picked up also in Isaiah 60. Isaiah 60 contributes, it seems to me, at least 2 things to Revelation's picture of this bride coming down. One of them is the glory light of God that illumines the city, which in Isaiah 60 reads like this: Arise, shine, your light has come, the Lord's glory has shone upon you. Though darkness covers the earth and gloom the nations, the Lord will shine on you, and God's glory will appear over you. And then there are foreigners, nations who come to your light, kings who come to your dawning radiance. It goes on, countless camels will cover your land, young camels from Midian and Ephah. They will come from Sheba, proclaiming the Lord's praises. All Kedar sheep will be gathered to you. Rams from Nebaioth will be your offerings. So on and on Isaiah goes about all the foreigners in the nations that come into the presence of God. A drawing of the nations that's echoed in Jerusalem 29, where there are all these nations who come to the light of God's glory. Verse 23, the city doesn't need, this is Revelation 21, the city doesn't need the sun or moon to shine on it, because God's glory is its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations walk by its light, and the kings of the earth bring their glory to it. So there is this streaming of the nations that's coming in Revelation. So take a look at the Isaiah text and take a look at the Revelation text and notice that Revelation isn't simply telling us, oh, this is what the seer saw. The seer John is very carefully crafting his vision of the future by building on the text of Isaiah that came before. So the vision of the Jerusalem is a glorification, even an amplification of the vision that we find at the end of Isaiah. But there's one more thing I want us to see about these visions, and that is that in some ways they are similar to visions of Ezekiel. Ezekiel is told in chapter 40 to take a measuring stick and measure the Jerusalem. And similarly, in Revelation 21, verse 15, there's an angel with a measuring rod who measures the width. So there's this idea of a measurement of this perfect cube of a city that John sees coming down. Similarly, in Ezekiel 43, there is the arrival of the glory of God. In Ezekiel, he sees God's glory coming back, entering in through the east gate in Ezekiel 43. So there is that glory imagery, Ezekiel, what we started with at the beginning of our Revelation lesson. And then finally, there is a river that runs out of this glorified cube structure in Ezekiel, similar to the way that there is a river that gives life to the nations that runs out of Jerusalem or runs through the middle of Jerusalem in Revelation's vision. But here is the huge difference. Ezekiel's whole vision from chapter 40 to the end is about not Jerusalem, but it's about the temple. For Ezekiel, the whole thing is about the recreation of a glorious temple, a temple where God's glory is once again concentrated, a temple that's full of glory where the nations bring their offerings, a temple out of which flows this river. But in Jerusalem, in this heavenly Jerusalem that John sees, we're explicitly told the following. I didn't see a temple in the city, because its temple is the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb. In John's vision, there is a somewhat intentional subversion of this expectation that the central meeting place of God is this special secluded temple structure. No, it's the whole city that is filled with the glory light of God, not just the temple. And God himself fills it. He is the temple's glory. The Lamb is the temple's glory. So you don't need this temple. God himself is the temple, the place where God is worshipped, the place from which the blessings of God flow. So there is, it seems at the end, a transformation of Ezekiel's hopes and maybe even a little bit of a subversion of it as the temple, as the city of Jerusalem is filled with the glory of God and the glory of the Lamb. The temple isn't the glory, God is. So as you go to your discussion, think about these things. Here's some possible things to discuss. You don't have to discuss all three. What allusions to the Old Testament do you find most interesting or difficult, or do you want to wrestle with? And go for it. Wrestle with it more. Where is there continuity and discontinuity between the Old Testament's David and Revelation's Davidic king? Do you think that the lamb imagery is supposed to transform how we think about David? Remember, David's problem, why he couldn't build a temple in the Old Testament, is because he was a man of war. Is that warlike Davidic king being subverted by this sacrificed lamb in chapter 5 and elsewhere. And finally, what is the effect of combining allusions? Either the allusions to Isaiah and Ezekiel in Revelation 21, or maybe the allusions to Daniel and Joel in Revelation 14. Talk about some of those mixed citations if you want to, mixed allusions, and wrestle together with the impact that might have on how we read. This is our last delve into the New Testament itself. Next week, we're going to start talking about not just what do we see in the New Testament's use of the Old, but how do we end up describing that, and are we free to do those same kinds of things ourselves? So we'll be moving from descriptive into the prescriptive task. So enjoy your last delve into Revelation and what the seer has done for you. Oh, and watch out for those sickles hanging high above your head.